Great to see you.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're opening our next session,
Around for next
and
week, right?
it's our afternoon event highlight focus session. And the theme is first things first, securing the means to finance a rebuilding process, Ukrainian government perspective, US government perspective, to present these perspectives, we have two great speakers. Okay, first speaker is Ambassador Mike Carpenter, and from the U.S. perspective, the Ukrainian perspective will be the DCM of our Ukrainian embassy here in Washington, Dennis Senik.
How long are you going to talk?
And also, after we get these two perspectives, we're going to get the diaspora perspective from our newly elected president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Mike Salmon. So we'll start off. I'll introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Mike Carpenter, who currently serves as the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council. Before that, the ambassador was the permanent representative to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And before the Biden administration took office, Ambassador Carpenter was the managing director of the Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. And during the Obama administration, Ambassador Carpenter was at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and Conventional Arms Control. Just from a personal note, I know Ambassador Carpenter since 2014. I've escorted many Ukrainian visitors to his office when he was at the NSC working for then Vice President Biden. And I would say that Ambassador Carpenter is probably one of the top 5 champions of Ukraine in Washington. And I remember a phrase, I remember it to this day. The Ukrainian delegation was talking about the need for arming up Ukraine. And Mike said, I agree with you, my boss agrees with you, but my boss's boss doesn't. So that was the Obama administration. But when we saw President Biden come into power, billions upon billions of dollars worth of military aid has poured into Ukraine. Okay, and that's a huge step forward. And also as ambassador to OSCE, I personally always read Ambassador's statement on Ukraine and on the ongoing conflict, which was probably the best statements, pro-Ukrainian statements out of the American government that were ever written. So I'll ask Ambassador Carpenter to open up the session.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yes? Okay, great. I didn't prepare a speech, so it won't be as eloquent as some of those statements at the OSCE. I'm just going to have a conversation with you, and then we can have questions, because I think that's going to be a little bit more natural and perhaps entertaining as well. I'll start out with the basic proposition that there is no plan B here. Ukraine has to win this war. A plan B is so unthinkable that there is no sense even talking about it. Ukraine has to prevail. It has to push back Russian forces. It has to maintain its sovereign, democratic, independent character, because, as I said, the alternative is so scary that no administration of any flavor would want to contemplate that. I mean, it would just put us on a trajectory towards conflict around the world, a world in which might makes right, larger, well-armed neighbors invade countries that are smaller, that don't have the wherewithal to defend themselves, and it would plunge us into decades, if not a century, of darkness. Not to mention the fact that the war that the Russian Federation is perpetrating against Ukraine is one that is being waged very deliberately and consciously through war crimes, crimes against humanity, and a determined, centralized effort to wipe Ukraine off the map, to eliminate Ukrainian culture and national identity. Obviously, the implications of that beyond Ukraine are unthinkable if we were to see this repeated in other contexts or in other parts of the world. And goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, other autocratic powers, powerful countries that have the wherewithal to wage this kind of war are looking very carefully at what Russia is doing in Ukraine and potentially judging whether this is something that they could get away with in the future. And so it's incumbent on us to ensure that we don't pass off that type of lesson to other dictatorships that would want to effectuate an aggression against their neighbors. So where are we today, almost now 1,000 days into Russia's war against Ukraine? Well, we're at a very precarious point. And it's precarious in Ukraine, but there's also some reasons to believe that it's precarious in Russia. And we have to, I think, keep both of those thoughts in our head as we contemplate the policy response to what we're seeing. In Ukraine, we obviously are going to be facing a very difficult and very challenging winter. There will be rolling blackouts, most likely in large parts of the country, in major urban centers for hours, potentially for longer than hours, depending on what the temperatures are this winter. If there are prolonged periods of very, very cold temperatures, then it's going to be really extraordinarily difficult for people to make do, given the fact that so much of Ukraine's energy grid has been degraded by Russian airstrikes. At the same time, the situation on the forward line of troops is also difficult. I think it's manageable, but it's difficult. Russian forces are trying to effectuate a slow grind in the Donbass, pushing on Pokrovsk, pushing on Chasiv Yar. Selidove was the latest small town to fall to Russian forces, but where Ukrainian defenders are bravely holding their line and exacting pretty significant costs on the Russian aggressor. In Kursk, in the Russian Federation, Ukrainian forces have effectuated what is a tactical success. Operationally, they have set this up to be able to hold this salient for a period of time. It's unclear exactly for how long, and whether the Ukrainian armed forces can translate this tactical success into an operational and strategic success. That remains to be seen. The latest news, of course, is that there are now approximately 10,000 North Korean troops that are in the Russian Federation. We judge that they are flowing towards the Ukrainian theater. It's unclear how they will perform, if they are in fact engaged in combat tasks or whether they are kept in a more support role. That remains to be seen. But clearly the battlefield is dynamic. It is one where Ukraine has imposed some dilemmas on the Russian Federation through the Kursk operation, but where the Ukrainians also face dilemmas. So what should be the policy response? And I'm sorry, this is not just about reconstruction, Doc, here. I'm looking at the big picture. We'll get to reconstruction in a second and the financial support. But I think you can't talk about reconstruction and recovery unless you talk about the big picture and what's happening on the battlefield. Right now, the imperative for the United States and for our allies and partners who support Ukraine is to conceptualize with our Ukrainian friends a plan to train and equip new brigades for which Ukraine will have to mobilize additional forces, additional recruits, to be able to hold the front lines in Donetsk and Luhansk, and then position themselves so that in 2025 they can proceed with liberation of additional territory. That is how I see it. This is not an easy proposition. There needs to be more, better, longer training from Western partners with the UAF. We have a couple of brigades right now being trained outside the country by some of our partners. We're training, the United States, are training as well. But we need to expand the scale and scope of what we're doing. We need to go beyond basic training, and we need to go beyond a brigade or a couple of brigades when you factor in our partners, and really look at helping Ukraine with standing up at least 10, if not a dozen, new brigades in the near term. This is essential to success on the battlefield. You can't stand up a new brigade, however, unless you can equip the brigade. And it's also very difficult to mobilize recruits to serve in the armed forces unless they know that Western partners are providing the equipment so that when they go to the front lines, they are not merely cannon fodder, but that they have the equipment to be able to fight back and to fight back effectively. As I think the audience in this room knows, the United States, will spend down every dollar of our obligated security assistance by the end of this year. Not all of that assistance will flow this year. Some of it will depend on production line timelines, and so some of it will flow next year. But all of it essentially will be spent down by the end of this year, which means we need to find additional resources. We need to find additional sources of equipment for Ukraine's brigades. That is why President Biden planned and still plans to host a Ramstein summit, a summit of the leaders of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, to elicit from our partners additional supplies, equipment, materiel, and weapons to be able to equip these forces that Ukraine needs. We will work, and I know that General Cavoli and General Brown are in communication, pretty much constant communication, with General Syrskyi, General Barhilevich, other members of the Ukrainian military, to devise a plan for how we do the training and equipping and how we marry it with this mobilization effort, which will be needed from our Ukrainian friends to be able to prevail in this conflict, which is where I started. We need not just to hold the lines, not just incremental progress. We have to turn the tide of the conflict. It will take time, but we can do it, provided that we have the resources. And to state the obvious, spending down every dollar of this supplemental means that additional financial resources will be needed as well. Now, when it comes to the energy situation, I mentioned the very difficult winter. This is an area where the United States is also stepping up. It's not getting the same attention as what we're doing in terms of military assistance, but it's just as important. And it relies on a strategy that has various different lines of effort that are complementary, where again, we need to work with our Ukrainian partners to be able to ensure that their energy grid and that their system remains intact over the course of the coming months. That means finding sources of distributed generation across the country, so there are not large targets for the Russian forces, but that there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of points of energy generation across the country, which will make it harder for Russian forces to take that offline. We need to look at leasing options for energy to be brought into the country. We need to look at how we can bring sources of energy from Ukraine, from the European energy grid into Ukraine. Some of the diplomacy around that is going on right now. I think there's more to be done there. And then we need to look at what we have been doing, I think, to great effect, which is providing support for what's called passive protection. It's essentially these very large concrete sarcophaguses that go around some of the switch yards and other energy grid infrastructure and provide a real deterrent against Russian attacks, and then also survivability for the equipment if in fact there is an attack. Now, as we build up Ukraine's capabilities and allow it to survive and eventually go back on the offense and liberate territory, we also need to take a good hard look at imposing costs and degrading Russian forces. And here, what I started out saying that there are dilemmas and vulnerabilities on the Ukrainian side, but there are also dilemmas and vulnerabilities on the Russian side. We have seen casualties on the front lines since May, since the late spring on the Russian side that are the highest they've been since the very beginning of this war. Essentially, since the Russians mounted the offensive into the Kharkiv Oblast, they have seen forces degraded at rates unlike what we've seen for the last 2 years. And I think the fact that they have had to rely on North Korean troops is a testament to the fact that their manpower, at least if Putin chooses not to do an additional mobilization, which I think for political reasons he's reluctant to do, or otherwise he surely would have done it by now. I think it shows how stretched thin they are. So we need to effectuate a change in terms of how Russia perceives its staying power in this conflict. And that means looking at additional sanctions, additional costs in the financial and energy sectors. And, as typical for a government official, I'm not going to preview any announcements that we may be making in the near-term future. But I think this is an area where clearly there is headroom for imposing substantial, I would say, additional costs. Don't believe the pundits who write that sanctions are ineffective, that we're tapped out on sanctions, that there's nothing more that we can do. Anders Oslund and others in this room have written very eloquently about what more we can do. There's a lot more that the U.S. can do, and it's, of course, only magnified if we do it together with our European partners. So we should be doing that. The big prize here are Russian frozen assets. We now have an agreement within the G7 to provide $50 billion to Ukraine. It's going to be a grant. It'll function as a loan, but it's really a grant. I would say it's actually Ukraine's money that they deserve to have, that we will be providing to them. But there is the principle of the frozen assets. It's, in Europe, roughly $200 billion. It's a lot of money that can leverage even more money if you structure it as loans, as we have with the windfall proceeds from these frozen assets. And so that's a conversation that needs to happen. I will tell you our G7 partners are not yet there in terms of agreeing to use the principle, but that doesn't mean that we can't continue the conversation and try to arrive at a solution where we mobilize all assets for Ukraine's recovery, for its reconstruction. It's only right that in the conditions of a just and lasting peace settlement, that Ukraine have the sufficient proceeds from the aggressor to be able to pay for its recovery. And then, last thing I'll end on is we have to sequence our strategy for Ukraine in the right way. We have to understand how we get from, and this is the conversation that we've been having with our Ukrainian friends ever since President Zelensky came here to this town and presented the victory plan to President Biden. We've been having this conversation about, okay, we are at a point in time now where the situation on the front lines is difficult. We're going to be at a point in time when we have all 32 allied parliaments ready to ratify Ukraine's NATO membership, where Ukraine has an Article 5 security guarantee. But how do we envision the process of getting from where we are today to that end goal? And here I would point to the importance of the bilateral security agreements, the one that the United States has signed with Ukraine, but also Now, I believe it's 22 of our partners, maybe with Croatia, it's now 23, or Greece, I forget the exact number, but we're close to 24 bilateral security agreements. We need to look to see how we can bring forward in time some of the commitments in those agreements. Ours is, at least a large part of it is legally binding. That's important to note. And so some of our partners as well. And so there's opportunity there that needs to be harvested and brought forward. And then we need to also think about an aspect that was conceptualized in the Zelensky victory plan, which is how do we collectively create a future force in Ukraine that has sufficient deterrent capabilities so that if we get to a point where Ukraine has turned the tide, that we can also impose a deterrent so that whatever happens, if there were to be a future negotiation or whatever pause in fighting may come, whether it's in 2 months or 2 years or 2 decades, whatever it is, that we have deterrence on the ground to prevent Russia from reattacking. Because my supposition, and this was actually articulated very nicely in a recent piece by my friend Ivan Krastev in the Financial Times, my supposition right now, and I think not all assessments, but most of the spot on assessments are that Putin has no desire to negotiate anytime soon, and that we should be prepared to impose additional costs on Russia for some period of time until the Kremlin sees the futility of continuing this conflict. That's not something that's going to change, certainly by the end of this year. That's going to require a sustained effort to get Russia to see that no matter how many additional bodies it throws at this conflict, no matter how many additional forces it fields from North Korea or drones that it fields from Iran, that actually time is not on its side. Right now, I personally think Putin thinks that time is on his side. So we need to change that. We need to shift that dynamic. We need to shift that mindset. And that requires some real deterrent capabilities that we're not going to provide unilaterally, but which we have to do together with our partners and allies. And we're having the conversation all the time. We will have it at Ramstein. This will be or if we may not do it in Ramstein, but if we do the Ramstein Summit, as we're calling it, that'll be an opportunity to really bring all of our partners in on a plan to train, equip, and then provide this deterrent capability so that, as I said, Ukraine wins. There's no plan B. There's no alternative. Thank you, Mikola.
Thank you. That's great words. And now comes to our second speaker. Originally, we had Ambassador Oksana Makarova scheduled, but as our former Minister of Foreign Affairs told us last night over dinner, the Ukrainian diplomatic corps is at its busiest that it's ever been in its existence. So, but in her stead, we have the Deputy Chief of Mission, Mr. Denis Zenik, who's also a veteran of earlier conferences. And, you know, his words are always very authoritative and very informative. Mr. Zenik.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me thank you for organizing this important event and for inviting me. But let me also highlight the presence of our Foreign Minister, Boris Tarasuk, the person who gave me this job actually many years ago and signed the order on enlisting me in the diplomatic service of Ukraine. It's a great honor to be here with you. Mike, I just realized you just stole my lines, and
That's why I wanted to go first.
Yeah, I understand that. I agree with everything. However, I would just say that we need all this, but more. Why do we need more? Is pretty simple, because as Mike said, Russians will not stop this war this year. They are not ready to stop this war next year or whatsoever. All what Putin wants is a complete defeat of Ukraine. So the only way for us to be able to stop Putin is to make Ukraine strong enough so that he would agree to start negotiations. By the time he feels that Ukraine is not strong enough, he will not only continue the war against my country, but he would escalate it, no doubt. So my point is, as we had many discussions during the visit of my president to the United States and all other political and diplomatic engagements, is that it is important to arm Ukraine to such extent and to give Ukraine those permissions we need so that we would escalate the situation, which will lead eventually to de-escalation from the Putin side. And you heard our expectations, they are on the table. I must tell you that the assistance we received from the United States of America is vital, no doubt. Without the US security assistance in particular, the life of Ukrainians would be much more harder, and we would lose definitely more lives, as we could see at the beginning of this year when we had problems with the supplies of weapons to Ukraine. Luckily, we now have that situation resolved because of the strong position of President Biden, whole administration, and bipartisan support in the Congress. But at the same time, what we can see now is that Putin does not stop. He is involving North Korean troops that we expect pretty soon will attack Ukrainian forces. He is talking to many other countries and partners of his own to disrupt our activities, including peace formula. And in addition to that, he is working with the international organizations. And it is worrying. The fact that Secretary General of the United Nations traveled to Kazan recently to take part in the BRICS summit was appalling. And the Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine made it clear. Should not be like that. But this is the reality. And we should, I believe, ask ourselves the question, why it is happening like that? My answer is that Ukraine simply must show even more results on the front line. But showing more results on the front line also is directly connected with the ability of Ukraine to defend better. By saying that, I mean that we need more air defense, more missile capabilities, and the ability to strike Russian targets, military targets on the Russian territory. In that way, we will diminish the Russian military potential, and we will save more lives of Ukrainians. And we will, I have no doubts, start gaining on the front line. But as I'm talking on about the military and political pretext, it is really important to talk about the financial one and rebuilding one, as I was asked to talk. Because securing means to finance and rebuilding Ukraine is as much important as the security assistance to Ukraine. And as you know, the most recent survey of the World Bank, European Commission, and Ukraine determined that repairing the current damage to Ukraine stands at $486 billion, which is nearly triple Ukraine's GDP in 2023. But because of the continued Russian attacks, even this number is not accurate. And it's a huge burden on Ukraine's economy. And just like this year, the next year, we are expected to face the deficit of more than $38 billion. And of course, we are grateful to our partners for helping us to preserve the economy and continue defending from Russia. And the input of the United States and EU and G7 and all other allies was instrumental, having those resources but at the same time, the government of Ukraine has done tremendous work, homework to keep the economy first running, and second in carrying out unprecedented reforms. So basically, there is no sphere of life in Ukraine which hasn't been touched by reforms, and that's in the time of war. And of course, it was done not only as the requirement on our path to the European Union and NATO, but simply because it is the right thing to do. I think that the best reflections and milestones, if I can call them, are first that we started negotiations on the EU membership. EU would never agree to start those negotiations with us if we are not successful on the reforms path. And second, that recently we have conducted the 5th review with the IMF. We completed the 5th review of the extended fund facility, and never before, actually, in our history, we had Ukraine made such progress on cooperation with the IMF, and it allows us to use even more resources from our partners. And we have started already preparations for the 6th review. And as our delegation that visited Washington last week with the finance minister and the governor of the National Bank made it clear that we are committed to fulfill all the IMF benchmarks, reform benchmarks. That is essential. No exceptions and no excuses. But of course, to ensure the continuity of the external assistance is vital to sustain economy and continue reforms. And as Mike said, mentioned the 50 billions in extraordinary revenue acceleration loans to Ukraine are instrumental. And I must commend the personal efforts of Mike Carpenter and Dalip Singh and then Secretary Yellen. Outstanding work, lots of behind the closed doors work with G7 partners to make this a reality first. And second, we sincerely appreciate the decision of President Biden to provide Ukraine with 20 billion package out of that 50 billion agreed. And of course, we are grateful to the US Congress for the very important Repo Act earlier this year. This decision on $50 billion will allow us to continue the IMF program. Without having these external resources, the whole program could be potentially in danger. That is why it's very hard to overestimate the importance of this decision, and we really thank you for that. At the same time, as we are relatively secured for 2025, we must already think about 2026. And in this regard, and think about all the spheres: military, economic, budgetary, humanitarian, energy, and the rest. And we are sincerely grateful to President Biden for authorizing the rest of the amounts of financial resources under the PDA program and the available resources under USAI, FMF programs. But at the same time, we need two things. First is that we have a constant supply of weapons for Ukraine, and we are blessed to have this commitment from the administration. At the same time, we need to start working already now on securing another supplemental in Congress for Ukraine. Because as I said, economic assistance, budgetary assistance, and the military assistance is actually one package which I would call a defense assistance for Ukraine. It's hard to differentiate them. And we will continue our homework here to explain why it is so important to provide Ukraine with both the military assistance and the budgetary assistance. But as we talk about, while we are committed to increase the domestic revenues as a result of reforms in Ukraine, I think that we should work harder on getting the decision of G7 countries on the whole body of Russian frozen assets. We heard Mike saying that it is a hard decision, no decision basically yet achieved, but it is simply unfair to have those 200 billion sitting and not being used for Ukraine at the time when Russia continues causing even bigger damage to Ukraine's economy. And but at the same time, as we talk about securing finances and rebuilding Ukraine, I must tell you that the work of the US administration on rebuilding Ukraine was instrumental. The personal efforts of Penny Pritzker then and Deputy Secretary Richard Wehrman now give us good prospects, both bilaterally and multilaterally, as we are already preparing for the next recovery conference that Italy will host in 2025. But as we talk about rebuilding Ukraine, we must always keep into account that the ultimate priorities are the critical and social infrastructure of Ukraine. As the winter is coming, the top priority is energy. You heard already Mike saying that it's going to be a very difficult winter for us. And I think that Russians would do their best to make it definitely more difficult for us this year than last year, simply even because of the fact that in the last 2 months, we haven't seen those major attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. It simply means that Russians are accumulating all those missiles they have in stock piles to send them at Ukraine. The problem is that Russians have their own missiles that they produce. They also have North Korean missiles, and apparently they have Iranian missiles. And another problem is that Iranian missiles are quite precise. So we should work more on securing air defense to Ukraine. As long as Ukraine is not able to protect its critical infrastructure, we will have more damage for Ukraine's economy, which means we will again be more dependent on external sources. So as you see, it's all interconnected. We are committed to support private businesses in Ukraine, to launch joint enterprises, including with our American partners. But we have to make sure that they are protected. In that case, American investments would be willing and ready to come to Ukraine and work there. And here comes the issue of war risk insurance. That is vital, and grateful to the work of the US administration and DFC already done. But the reality is that it's a continued need that we have, and the more investors are secured and their investments are secured, the better, the more investors will come to Ukraine. Another issue which is of vital importance for rebuilding Ukraine is the change of the travel advisory by the United States State Department. As you know, the current travel advisory is level 4, do not travel, which literally stops American investors to come to Ukraine and work there because insurance companies will not issue insurance for them. And this is the issue that yet has to be resolved. And we would be sincerely grateful to our American partners if they could, for example, follow the British example and just to change the travel advisory at least partially for some regions in Ukraine. But as I talk about foreign investments and reforms in Ukraine, I must tell you that it is absolutely essential to deprive Russia of the possibility to get more revenues for its economy. Sanctions are absolutely vital. The fact is that the US administration has done a great job. We have thousands of Russian entities sanctioned and those of Russian partners sanctioned. But the reality is that every time Russia gets used to those sanctions and they find the new ways, right, how to circumvent them. So it's a continued work that has to be carried out. And in this regard, you heard the position of my ambassador many times. We call on to sanction the whole banking sector of the Russian Federation, with a few exceptions of the international subsidiaries. To our mind, that will be instrumental. Without that, Russia will continue getting revenues for its budget from oil, gas, and trading via other countries. So having Russia sanctioned, having Ukraine strong enough military to deter Russian aggression, having Ukraine strong enough to defend from Russian aggression, including, air defense, and changing travel advisory for Ukraine and having more war insurance, risk insurance, to attract more investments in Ukraine, those are instrumental and those are our priorities, which have to be, of course, which not have to be, but these may be only successful with the continued external assistance from our partners and of course by the United States of America. Thank you.
Unfortunately, the ambassador needs to return to the National Security Council to fulfill, obviously, his busy duties in protecting our country. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks. Thank you.
The next speaker is everybody in this room probably knows Michael Salkyu as the director of the Ukrainian National Information Service, our Ukrainian diaspora advocacy office here in Washington, D.C. But also, I'd like to announce that 2 weeks ago, Michael was elected the president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, the diaspora umbrella organization. The diaspora is very important in constituent politics in the United States. The UCCA and UNIS have for years engaged in advocacy for the Ukrainian cause, for Ukrainian freedom, and also on the local level, because the diaspora organizations like UCCA, the organization which I head up, the Ukrainian, the Organization for Defense of Ukrainian War Freedoms, we have branches on the local level. And the old saying is all politics is local. And it's the local Ukrainian American voters that make a difference. And they made a huge difference in making sure that the aid gets passed several months ago. Okay, one of the key motors behind that aid was Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, who's the co-chair of the Ukraine caucus in Congress, and Representative Mike Quigley, who's also co-chair of that same caucus. And both our organizations have constituents in their districts. I'm a constituent of Mike, of Brian Fitzpatrick. So that's the importance of the Ukrainian diaspora. So Mike, please.
The floor is mine. Thank you. Thank you, Mykola. Good afternoon to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mykola, for the kind words about my election. In terms of being the president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, it's a monumental task now to lead the Ukrainian American community. Not to say that obviously in the past almost 1,000 years or 2 years and 8 months of this war, what we as a Ukrainian community have done, but what we can still do in the future. I'd like to borrow a phrase from a good friend of mine that is sitting in the audience, Ambassador Dan Freed. I just mentioned in the previous panel discussion that there's lots of time until there's no time left. And ladies and gentlemen, we don't have that much time left. I'd like to bring you to two particular figures, if I may. The first figure is 1,000 days. On November 20th of 2024 will be 1,000 days of a genocidal war on the European theater. This type of war has not happened since World War II, since the end of World War II in 1945, when a supposed peace of two polar worlds came together to initiate at least harmony within a greater world. But we must understand what in these 900 plus some odd days leading up to the 1,000, what does a Ukrainian victory mean? We've heard from our two previous speakers from the National Security Council as well as from the Embassy of Ukraine about what victory or how victory should be accomplished in Ukraine. But let's think about what victory truly means, not just for Ukraine, but victory means in terms of the defense of democratic principles, not just in Ukraine, but worldwide. Victory in Ukraine also means the defense of Western values, those values which we hold near and dear as we come up to next week's presidential and congressional, local, and statewide elections here in the United States as well. So for us as a Ukrainian community, we understand and we value what peace means. But peace just does not mean a cessation of a kinetic war. Peace does not just mean putting down arms on one side or on the other side. It has to be a sustainable peace. And that is something that we as a Ukrainian American community have been vying for years and obviously seek in terms of a justified peace for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. There must be deterrence. Previous speakers have spoken about this. To build up Ukraine's deterrence, basically what is necessary, and what I will say, is to immobilize the imperialistic tendencies of the Kremlin. Secession can happen in terms of the fire between one border or across the borders. But if you do not immobilize those tendencies of once again building up an army, once again trying to demolish a nation state, a people, a culture, its heritage, then obviously we have a lot of work to do as the global world. I mentioned the 1,000 days of war, which will be November 20th of 2024. And it's most interesting what the next day is commemorated in Ukraine of November 21st of 2024. November 21st of every year is the Day of Dignity in Ukraine. That was the day that the revolution of dignity, that the Euromaidan revolution began on November 21st of 2013. And to think about where we've come since 2013 to where we are today, unfortunately, in February and in March of 2014, we had the invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea, the illegal invasion as well of eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region. And we as a Ukrainian community stood up at that particular moment in world history to our elected officials to say, please, help Ukraine defend, Ukraine must defend itself against any future attacks from the Russian Federation. By no means are we wizards in terms of predicting the future, but what we are is cognizant of the history. And from that history can predict the future. And while we never predicted February 24th of 2022, we knew that if there wasn't adequate deterrence for Ukraine, then something of that nature would happen and happen sometime soon. There was mention about sanctions. And I believe that sanctions are absolutely positively necessary, again, on behalf of the Ukrainian American community. Is this something we have done through our members of Congress, through our constituents in the past? Many of you may remember the CATSA legislation of 2017, Countering American Adversaries Through Sanction Act, brought forth a comprehensive sanctions package against 4 very relevant countries in today's genocidal, almost 1,000 days war in Ukraine. It brought together sanctions against Russia. It brought together sanctions against Iran. It brought together sanctions against North Korea, and it brought together sanctions, comprehensive sanctions, including Syria. 3 of those 4 countries that I have just mentioned obviously have a stake in a role in the Kremlin's aggression against Ukraine. And at that particular time, we had the capacity and still have the capacity, and any administration has the authorities vested within that law to promote furthering sanctions. But that doesn't mean that we stop there. We as a Ukrainian community will be diligently working in the remaining lame duck session after the elections in the United States until the end of the year, and in a new 119th Congress, to put forth a comprehensive sanctions package against Russia. A comprehensive sanctions package that includes sanctions against the energy sector, that includes a comprehensive sanctions package against the banking sector of the Russian Federation. It's very difficult to understand, to comprehend, that Russia can still do international transactions with a lot of our allies and partners in this war of aggression against Ukraine. That must be stopped, and it must be stopped quickly. That revenue that unfortunately comes to the Russian Federation through its sale of oil and other types of petroleum products, its sale of and using a ghost fleet coming from some of our European allies, as a matter of fact, must be stopped, and must be stopped quickly. This gives the revenue to the Russian Federation to continue its genocidal war of Ukraine. And unfortunately, the victims of Ukraine, of that genocidal war, are the innocent civilians and those on the front lines in Ukraine. But not to, once again, restate the obvious. It is not just those victims of Ukraine. It's world democracy that is at stake right now. And I leave you with the second figure. And the second figure is 7 days. In 7 days, we will have a presidential election in the United States. In 7 days, we will have congressional elections in the United States. The entire body of the United States House of Representatives, all 435 congressmen will be elected. 34 out of 100 senators will be elected. There will be a plethora of elections on statewide basis for governors, and obviously on a local scale for mayors, your county executives, and so forth. Our role as a Ukrainian community is to ensure that our voice is heard with those elected officials and within the electoral process. In the past 1,000 days, or in the past 10 years of the war against Ukraine, we have been advocating. We have been stomping our feet. We have been meeting with our representatives night and day and night. We must continue that fight in a new Congress. We must continue that same advocacy, if not even stronger, with a new administration, whichever that administration may be, so that the voices of those innocents that are being killed on a daily basis in Ukraine are heard and are heard loudly. But don't get me wrong, this is not just the Ukrainian American community that is concerned about the war of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We have partners. We have partners in the Polish American community. We have partners in other Central and East European communities. We have partners in the Jewish community. We have partners, frankly speaking, in the Hispanic and the Latino community as well, that understand what either A, communism, or B, authoritarianism means to their peoples as well and to their nations. So we must join this fight together. I look forward to interacting with all of you. I look forward to visiting your respective communities. I look forward to interacting with those elected officials here in Washington, D.C. in my tenure as president to advance the interests of the Ukrainian community. There is something to be said about the work of the Ukrainian community in the past 2.5 years of the war, and in particular for 6 months of a brutal battle for the supplemental bill on Capitol Hill. Let's not have a brutal battle as well for the next 2 months. Let's understand that an additional supplemental is absolutely critical for Ukraine to win this war. And there is only way for Ukraine to win this war, and it has to be victorious against the imperialistic mindset of the Kremlin. I thank you for your attention and look forward to any questions.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. I'm going to ask the next panel to come up and be seated. That's moderator Ambassador William Taylor, Howard Schatz, and Jack Mendoza Wilson. I believe he's online, correct?
I'm online, but here.
Jack, we will get the room.
I'm glad you're on here.
Yeah, I'm glad you're moderating.
Wow, that's been moderated. The moderator. Does it turn on? Okay.
Jock is online and
Yep.
he has a hard out around 2:45 and that's when we're supposed to finish, so he's in Kiev.
He'll be as long as we want. Take what you need.
Okay.
I think take what you need. So, thank you. And Mikola, thank you all very much for this opportunity. I recognize Boris Tarsiuk. It's an honor to have you here. It's a delight to see you again. Glad to see you're in such fine shape. This has been a great panel. We're talking about resources. We're talking about resources for the defense of Ukraine. And we're talking about resources to reconstruct and repair Ukraine after the war, after the victory. And this will be an important piece. I'm very pleased that we've got Dr. Howard Schatz from RAND, again, and many other places, but we'll talk about RAND. And Jack Mendoza Wilson. Jack is well known to everyone in this room. And coming to us live from Kiev. Jack, glad to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here, or I'd rather really be there with you all, but never mind, I'm here in Kiev.
You are there in Kiev, and we're glad you're there, Jack. This is great. So I don't have to talk about the importance of this subject, the importance of resources. We've already heard a little bit throughout the day, but just from Mike Carpenter as well about the Dennis from the embassy about the $300 billion that are still there, the $50 billion that's already coming, 20 billion from the United States and 30 from EU, European nations. There's 300 or at least $200 billion more to come. And that will, I assume, will be the topic, Howard, of your comments. Why don't you go ahead John will come to you after Howard, and then we'll open for questions.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate the introduction, and I'm really grateful to be here. So I'm gonna talk about probably the most challenging part of mobilizing resources for recovery and reconstruction, and that is what can come from Ukraine itself. So one of the reasons for doing this is because what we've seen from successful post-war reconstruction episodes in the past, those of Europe after World War II, Central Europe after the fall of the wall, and elsewhere, is that there have really been three pillars of financing. One has been aid, one has been foreign private investment, and then a third pillar, which is often neglected, is funds coming from the country itself that's reconstructing. Now, as you heard from earlier today, Ukraine has a fourth source, and that's the Russian assets. And the only thing I'll say about the Russian sovereign assets, and Bill can back me up, is for many of us, it's been a very long journey from the initial thought that no, we can't do that because it will put the international financial system at risk, to, well, of course we're going to do that. The only question is how. And I think ultimately we get to the of course we're going to do it because reconstruction is a priority of the United States and Europe, and they don't want to pay for it. And therefore we have this big pool of money. So the Russian assets, we'll hear more about that. But those are basically the three traditional pillars of reconstruction. And so Ukraine's own funds will be important. Well, let's look at the current situation. How's Ukraine doing? Ukraine's actually been doing surprisingly well, considering that it's at war. We saw in 2022, GDP fell by 29.1%. It rose by 5.3% in 2023. And in 2024, we have four different projections, ranging from 3% at the IMF to 4.7% at the EBRD. All of those are quite positive considering the conditions. We've also seen Ukraine carry out reforms. So fulfilling the 7 steps that the EU required to start accession negotiations, and then starting accession negotiations. And we see a commitment from the EU as well. Very interesting, if you look at the mission letters. So first of all, Commission President von der Leyen, who will be starting on a second term, has created a position of Commissioner for Enlargement. So previously this was under Commission for Neighborhood and Enlargement. Now she wants a separate Commissioner for Enlargement. And in the mission letter from von der Leyen to Marta Koos, who is the proposed commissioner, von der Leyen calls for continued and sustained support of Ukraine, continued attention to accession and reconstruction, and again, for reconstruction. So a real commitment from Europe. I'd like to point out a few other things which were discussed, but I think they should be emphasized, which is even just in the past 2 months, September and now October, Ukraine has taken concrete steps to mobilize assets to maintain the economy and to set itself up for recovery and construction. So to talk about Ukraine-owned resources is something that Ukraine already knows about. So let me go through a few of these things. We've had a tax change, including an increase in the military levy and other tax changes. Plans are moving forward for more domestic bond financing at the end of the year. Working with the IMF, DCM Senate talk about the 5th review of the extended fund facility. We know about the $50 billion in financing. And then we have a debt agreement with private creditors. And for me, and I think for many people, and a point that Secretary Pritzker made constantly when she was special representative, is a customs reform law. So this is a concrete step at mobilizing resources, at making sure that resources that are available actually come to the government where they're supposed to be. And this is one sign of reforms regarding corruption. I'll come back to corruption soon. There is one other major pillar, and that's tax collection. So we'll come to that when I look forward, and that's what I want to do now. That's retrospective. Let's look forward about what can Ukraine do to mobilize resources, right? I think what I'll do is I'm going to suggest specific policies, and there's always a risk. Anybody who has been in government will hear ideas from outside, and the initial reaction is always, yes, we've thought of that. No, it won't work. yes, we tried it. And that's legitimate. People developing the policies will have far better information than anybody from outside. So treat these as potential ideas, ideas that can be changed, ideas that go in the hopper, ideas that may in fact work, either alone or with modification. So some steps that Ukraine will need to take. They will likely have to raise the value-added tax. They know that there's a healthy debate in Ukraine about that. But if you look at what the IMF is saying, I think with certainty that's going to be coming. Second big step they need to do is to actually implement the customs law and accelerate it if possible. They need the revenue, but it also sends a very powerful signal about anti-corruption, which will be important. A third potential step will go to risk insurance. So one of the more interesting things about the war risk insurance so far is that Ukraine, working with Marsh McLennan, came up with an innovative approach to open up sea lanes. And you don't just have outsiders such as Development Finance Corporation giving risk insurance. Ukraine is actually backing that up. So are there ways that Ukraine can expand war risk insurance for investors based on the type of investment and based on the resilience that they build into their investments? Let me go now to tax enforcement. So we said one pillar, customs reform, customs enforcement is important. The second big pool of money that is escaping the government is tax enforcement. And tax enforcement, better tax enforcement, fairer tax enforcement will do double duty. First of all, it will mobilize more revenue, which is important. It's going to be important for the future. Second, it will lower incentives for the shadow economy. And Ukraine's shadow economy is a big liability right now. And you have a shadow economy for a number of different reasons. But if Ukraine can actually enforce tax collection, there's less incentive to be in the shadow economy. Another reason for the shadow economy is, quite frankly, to avoid mobilization, to stay off the grid. And so here is probably, an idea that really needs to be vetted internally, but are there ways to simplify and regularize mobilization so that people have more certainty about what to expect, people know how long they will be in the service, people will know when they could get demobilized, and therefore there's less incentive to avoid what is now a very uncertain process. That also could help reduce the shadow economy. Let me go into a few more steps for the future. I want to go back to corruption. So this, I was very surprised. I'm going to call this the miracle on the Dnipro. Transparency International rates countries, and we know that Ukraine's rating is improving against all countries in the world. But for me, the most important population of countries that it's going to compete with are the 39 countries of Western Europe, the European Union, the Western Balkans, and I would include Turkey in there too. So how has Ukraine done compared to those countries? Well, from 2012 to 2022, Ukraine has been dead last, okay? Which is quite disappointing. 2023, Ukraine moved up to number 36 out of 39, tied for 36. That's, given that everybody else is trying to improve their corruption rankings, that I think is a very important accomplishment. And it does bode well for future progress as well. Right now, it's tied with Serbia, it's ahead of Bosnia, it's ahead of Turkey. And we know that Turkey, with its level of corruption, is able to attract investment and have an ongoing economy. So, this makes a huge difference internally, it makes a huge difference externally in terms of garnering external support. Once we have an end to the fighting with some kind of deterrence, and that's I would emphasize what has come in past panels, deterrence is hugely important for this to work. Then Ukraine, to mobilize resources, will need serious state-owned enterprise privatization. This finally has to be done. This is a blot on the government. It is a huge hole in the economy, and hand in hand, so there needs to be a fair sales process, and hand in hand, there needs to be a strong anti-monopoly function. You want to avoid what has happened in other reforming countries in terms of concentration of assets. Ukraine can start on that now by creating a very transparent database of state-owned enterprises and signaling that it will go through this privatization. Once again, once we are embarked on reconstruction, there will have to be very careful sequencing of EU accession and the laws. So the EU will not be an unmitigated positive. Many of the laws and regulations of the EU could be counterproductive to Ukraine at this stage of its development. And so Ukraine will want to be very careful about what it adopts when. I would focus on things that will make it more business friendly, commercial code, contract disputes, anti-monopoly. And finally, focus on FDI. This is already a priority for Ukraine, one of three major priorities coming from economic officials, but a general focus on attracting FDI, considering incentives, looking at how other successful countries that attracted FDI have handled things will be very positive and also essential to controlling the wealth of domestic investors as well. It's the best form of competition. I'll stop there.
Howard, thank you. Thank you. A great list, both of where we've been, the growth in the past and the kinds of things that are on the table, moving forward, the reform business that you talk about, and then moving forward. I mean, this is a good list of actions that the government can take a look at. As you say, you know, this is from the outside. They've got a lot of information about this, their implications, political implications, security implications, as you talked about. But this is a good list. Thank you very much for that. John, it's evening there.
It is. It's
It
I think it's seven, 8:15. Yeah, 8:15. It's been a beautiful spring, a beautiful autumn sunny day here. When I was preparing for this, I said to Volodya that I hope that we had a quiet evening. There wouldn't be any air raids. So far, it's a beautiful day and a nice quiet evening. And the power here is now, at least at present, working normally. So we don't have those large power cuts that I think you experienced when you were here in July. So yeah, I wish I was with you, but I'm happy as ever to be in Kiev and for things to be working well. And looking forward to chatting with you.
Let's talk then. Why don't you, I saw you nodding your head a couple times as Howard was going through some of his recommendations.
Yes.
You probably got some additional thoughts. So go ahead, lead us off.
I'm probably coming at from a complementary position. Fortunately, hopefully, Howard and I's contribution complement one another. But certainly, I was in complete agreement with him on many of almost all the points he made. But one of my key ones, because SCM, SCM, for those who don't know, is Ukraine's largest private sector business. It's the largest investor, and it's owned by the businessman and philanthropist Rinat Akhmetov, who's my boss. Now, we're the largest taxpayer in Ukraine, and we understand that the real way to improve Ukraine's economy and improve government revenues is exactly as Howard outlined, which is not have the same people pay more, but have more people pay. And so I think this question of tax reform and customs reform is crucial in increasing the tax take for Ukraine without becoming overbearing on those who are already payers. As we know, one of the largest sectors in Ukraine's economy, regrettably, is the shadow economy. And the faster we can close that down, both for current expenditure and for future EU membership, the better. And so I think that was, yet again, a really splendid example. I think clearly Ukraine has made significant progress on fighting corruption, but as we know, regrettably, there's still a significant pathway to go for Ukraine to be seen as being a sound investment destination. Even before the war, whenever I was speaking to people about investing in Ukraine, there was always the same concern would be raised, which was the risk of corruption. And when we're talking about corruption, usually most businesses and most banks that you would speak to were very specific. It was about the transparency and reform of the legal system. And while that is progressing, there's still some way to go. So those are just a couple of remarks on what I thought was Howard's excellent presentation. I'm going to take it from a slightly different point of view, which is looking at investment. You know, we see lots of stories about the large funds that may be made available to Ukraine for recovery and reconstruction in a post-war environment. And, we've got a headline figure there from the report of the World Bank published in February this year of a need at that point in February of this year of at least 486 billion to reconstruct the Ukrainian economy. And of course, that was a figure that was in place before the significant Russian attacks that took place from the period of March through to, well, essentially to today. And so that figure is higher. Now, that investment is going to require both public sector funds, donor funds, Ukrainian government funds, and undoubtedly the private sector. And I want to focus more in my comments on what would happen from the private sector, because I think that in an immediate post-conflict situation, what we want to have in place is the ability for the Ukrainian economy to get that much needed foreign direct investment that Howard mentioned, and also to encourage investment from Ukrainian companies. In the situation that we face in Ukraine, which is high risk from the possibility of corruption, or high risk from conflict risk, high risk from political risk, what is really important is that those businesses that are either already investors in Ukraine, and of which there are a number of international investors who are doing extraordinarily well in Ukraine, and I'll mention some of them in a moment, and domestic businesses like our own who are already committed to Ukraine. I believe that in a post-war environment, those businesses are going to be the drivers of recovery. Why? Well, they're already here. They've operated during the war. Some of them have operated since 2014, when the Russians first took parts of Donbass. Many of them had continued to invest over that period. And they also have what I would describe as shovel-ready projects that can be immediately realized. Now, in a post-war period, Howard mentioned growth, and I'd mentioned growth. Growth has been good. You know, there are different estimates. The one I looked at said it would be 3.2% this year. Maybe it will be higher. But what we need to do in a post-war environment is to quickly drive economic growth. Why? Because if all parties need to see a fast recovery and see the investment potential, this is true for domestic investors, current international investors, and those foreign direct investors who may come in. So we need to have a fast bounce back. And the fastest bounce back is likely to come from domestic investors and from foreign direct investors who are already in the country, moving ahead quickly with their projects, given that they're already here, they have the resource, and they know the environment. What will that require? Rather than looking at the institutional investment that will come in perhaps later through the likes of the plans are being put together by the likes of BlackRock and JP Morgan, it'll be some time before those projects come to fruition. Even if being planned now, it'll be some time before those investors enter into Ukrainian marketplaces. Consequently, we need to make sure that foreign direct investors who are already here, and large domestic businesses, investors like ourselves who are already here, receive access to capital at an early stage in the post-war recovery. And that is likely to be a driver of economic growth. And that driver of economic growth, once we start seeing figures, which I know Anders was speaking earlier today, and I know he talks about the growth potential of Ukraine. We could see figures that could get close to or even into double digits. It's important to have that positivity, because that will make sure that the second stage of capital from those who have greater perception of risk is likely to enter the marketplace. The second aspect that I think will be important, and it was actually raised by Howard, and I'm very glad he raised it too, is political and conflict risk insurance. That's particularly true for new foreign direct investors coming into Ukraine. Now, we know there's the Marshall McLennan program with the Ukrainian government to protect trade through the Black Sea corridor has been vital in providing income to the Ukrainian economy. Our business, SCM, is one of Ukraine's largest exporters. The economy in Ukraine is hamstrung unless there is trade through the Black Sea. The rail routes across the border, the road routes across the border to Europe simply aren't large enough. So that political risk insurance and conflict risk insurance has been key. We need to see more of that. I know that at the moment we've already seen the French government and the German government providing political risk assurance through their investment guarantee programs to their investors coming into Ukraine at that moment. And that's a very healthy sign. And we need to see more countries stepping up to the mark with those types of investment guarantee schemes to support their investors coming into Ukraine. I know also that the EBRD, they mentioned it in a meeting that I was at this week, are in a process of putting together a test program for investment guarantee, which they hope to launch later this year. And that will be very good news when that come in. It's basically to trial investment guarantees, war risk and guarantees, in fact, so that insurers can then see the difference between the perceived risk, which I think we'd all agree insurers would see perceived risk as being high at present, but giving them the opportunity to have governments underwriting that insurance so they can see what the real risk is, which should make insurance over the medium term much lower, and that will definitely aid foreign investment into Ukraine. Now, the third aspect that is, and it's a trickier aspect, I think, to encourage investment, is human capital. As we know, a large number of citizens have left Ukraine, become refugees in other countries, primarily in the European Union, but also in the United States. And that's led to labor shortages. The latest information, which I got from the economic report of Ukrainian Business News, is that at the moment, amongst Ukrainian businesses, their largest concern is being able to staff their operations effectively. That is the single largest concern they have. You would have thought it might be access to capital or war risk, but it's not. It's human resource. Already in Ukraine, the level of demand for labor has reached that of 2021. And we have a real gap between labor and availability of labor. And there are 4 reasons why labor is not available in Ukraine, of those who are in Ukraine. One is we don't have the specialist skills. The people who have the specialist skills have either left or they've been mobilized. 2, there are a large number of people, males particularly, who don't want to go into the workplace, go into a physical workplace, because they're concerned, and again, Howard touched on this, on the questions of mobilization. They fear being mobilized and called to the front. And then we also have, again, this is a corruption-related risk, is that people don't want to work for official salaries. They want to work for unofficial salaries. And as most people in the room may know, Ukrainian business doesn't want to work in that way. It wants to work in a transparent way, but some employees prefer to have black money, and that is restricting their ability to enter into the labor force, because they're trying to find those who will pay them in cash and without the necessary taxation. So those are restricting the availability of labor at present. Now, if you take our own business, SCM, in our largest business, Metinvest, we have at present 4,000 vacancies that we could fill at time of war. And we really would like to fill those vacancies. So what we have done is we've brought in veterans who've returned from conflict, they finished their spell in the army, and we are retraining them to work in our business. So I think one of the aspects we'll need to address in the future is a policy for the reintegration of veterans into the workplace, looking at the structural unemployment that clearly already exists in Ukraine, and how can we persuade Ukrainians who've left the country to return, which kind of takes me back full circle to the fact that quickly after we have some form of peace or ceasefire, that we need to have fast economic growth that will both encourage those who are outside the country to return and give them the economic means to return by having decent jobs and living standards available for them here in Ukraine. Now, for those who don't know, it's good to say that actually there has been a significant number of investors who've invested in Ukraine during the war. For example, at the end of last month, a deal was concluded to purchase Ukraine's lifestyle telecoms business by a French investment company, NJJ Capital. It's a 600 million euro deal, and it's partly funded by EBRD and IFC. So there is confidence. You don't make that sort of decision invest that level of money unless you believe that in the longer term, Ukraine is a great place for capital. We could look at Germany and look at the German, it's a German biochemicals company, Bayer, which has built a seed production facility in Zoetermeer. In fact, they've invested $60 million at time of war in Ukraine. And we could look at Philip Morris, an American company, that has built a new cigarette production plant in Lviv. So we are seeing investment, and my own company, SCM, we have invested in 2023, we invested $0.81 billion in Ukraine. And this year we've invested $2 billion, most of it in Ukraine, quite significantly in building out Ukraine's energy system, particularly in the transition to renewable green energy, which is going to be exceptionally important in the integration of Ukraine's energy system into the EU. We're also constructing a battery facility to store that renewable energies, which is an essential part of the green transition and integration into the EU. And at the same time, in terms of trade, our business Lemtrans, which is a large transport and logistics company, has built a new $15 million container transshipment depot in Vinica. So, we see what can happen. And I think it's important when we think about those big numbers and foreign investors coming in, we need to get a great start when peace is declared. And the fastest start is the investment by Ukrainian companies and international companies already invested in Ukraine in the projects that they already have. And this will drive a positive, virtuous circle in persuading investors to enter into Ukraine in a post-war environment.
Doc, thank you. Thank you very much. A great set of observations. A couple of things I'm sure we're going to come back to. I'm going to first ask Howard if you have thoughts, comments, reflections on what Jacques just said. And then we're glad to have questions from the room. And I've got a couple for Jacques as well, but Howard, to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I do have thoughts. First of all, I'd love to appear on a panel with Jacques again. Jacques just did like the best thing that he could have done, which is number one, I learned something new. Number two, he covered material that I hadn't covered that we needed to cover. So thanks. So let me hit two of your points just to emphasize and maybe expand. The domestic investment. Not only do I agree, but I'll bring in a research result, which is that we see consistently in post-war situations, there is a delay between the time that the shooting stops and the time that the international community and assistance finally mobilizes. And in some cases, there's a long delay. And so, even I think one example is post-World War II, peace. We had peace in 1945. The Marshall Plan didn't start until 1948. All right, so a 3-year gap. We see these same gaps again and again. And we also see, as I said, domestic finance is mobilized. I didn't want to talk so much about that, and so I'm really grateful that Jacques brought it up. But yes, it's the businesses on the ground that know the system the best and know the opportunities the best, and will probably be the best partners to get things started. So that's the positive side. The troublesome or the side that doesn't have good solutions right now that everyone is struggling with is human capital. And we're seeing several problems. We're seeing population declines. If you look at a population pyramid of Ukraine, it's not very encouraging in that the population of people between ages 0 and 24, it's not a pyramid. And so we have, where will the future labor force come from? We would want to do everything we can to get return of refugees. Right now, refugees plus internally displaced people are about 10.3 million people out of a pre-war population of about 44 million. That's an enormous number. And so people are going to need incentives to come back. And right now, the European Union is looking at this issue too, because people in Europe in particular have quite generous benefits and are able to integrate into those societies more easily than refugees from other countries. And so, what the discussion is what's the combination of pull rapid economic growth? Should there be something of push? Should those benefits that refugees are getting in Europe be reduced in some way? Are there incentives among the things that colleagues and I are talking about? Are there incentives that Europe could give? If you go back to Ukraine now, you will always have the right to retire in Europe, for example. What is it that Europe can do to encourage people to go home? That's probably the biggest problem Ukraine faces right now. The related issue is that we don't have good labor force surveys of Ukraine right now, and we don't even have a really good estimate of the population. So I think here, and I would return to private businesses on the ground, is the best sense of what skills are out there and what skills are missing are always going to come from the people trying to do the hiring. And so I would say, just from a selfish standpoint, it was good to hear. And also from a research standpoint, when I do research, even though I have, all kinds of training in advanced statistical techniques, I always aim straight to talk to business people on the ground, because they're always going to have more information or different information than I'll ever have access to. And so we should all, the big puzzle is human capital, skill building, what to do about refugees. And that's right now not only a big puzzle, but probably the hardest problem that Ukraine will face for the long term.
Howard, thank you. Chuck, thank you. Let me just open it up to in the audience, and there's an immediate hand popped up. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, right. Please. Here comes the mic.
Thank you so much. My question is, there was a lot of discussion about foreign direct investment, and do you think there's a particular industry in Ukraine which really would benefit from foreign direct investment, specifically maybe the energy sector? Thank you.
Right, and introduce yourself, and everybody else can do the same thing. And we met out here, but please go ahead.
Sure, my name is Ksenia. I'm with Svetonic Organization.
Very good. Good question. Howard, right to Chuck. Yeah.
Yeah. So, looking at, we've been looking at this. So the first thing I would say is that the sectors which are already performing well in terms of foreign direct investment are likely to be the ones that will perform well after conflict. The first one in that area that's continued to perform well is agriculture. I was looking at some figures in preparation for today, and we still see investors coming in and purchasing Ukrainian agribusinesses or investing in businesses that they already have. Most recently, the Saudis, who've been big investors here in west of Ukraine in the agricultural sector, have come in and taken additional capital in an investment vehicle that they have. So I think that what we will see in advance of Ukraine's movement into the European Union and immediately after peace is a continued significant investment in the agricultural sector. And that will be two ways. Firstly, there'll be investment in the growing and harvesting, if you like, the farm business, agribusiness. But on the second side is going to be in the sector of food production. So that's really where you're adding value rather than exporting grains or exporting tomatoes or whatever it happens to be, that you're actually going up the value chain and adding value to that product in Ukraine before you export. And that's also a keynote for Ukraine in terms of moving up the skills economy rather than simply being the producer of natural resources, which has been the more historical role of Ukraine. So number one, agribusiness. Number two, defense sector. If you look at the list of defense businesses that are seeking and indeed are already entering into the Ukrainian market with the full support of their governments, then we'll see a significant uptick in defense sector investment. As you would imagine, Ukraine is moving away from a model from its donors of provision by donation or lend-lease of equipment into manufacturing of equipment wherever possible inside the Ukrainian marketplace. And you can see that. Rheinmetall, for example, already has a repair plant with a partner in Ukraine for military vehicles. From the United Kingdom, British Aerospace has already constructed in partnership with a partner a repair plant in Ukraine. And there are plans in place for more of that. I think Rheinmetall, which is the German military manufacturer, has plans to invest in at least 4 additional plants in Ukraine producing ammunition and other parts. So I think the defense sector is, and your last point on that, drones. Ukraine has world-class expertise on drones. And we will certainly see Ukraine being a center of drone development and manufacturing as we go forward in the future. So I would say that those two sectors strike me as those which will bounce back quickly. There's also in the retail sector, retail investment has continued in Ukraine. It still has a significant population that is underexploited in terms of retail environment. And I think we'll see more retail investors coming into Ukraine with some of the larger chains from Europe making progress in Ukraine. And then lastly, in the sector which I'm probably closest to, in energy, you're going to see significant investment in renewable energy as Ukraine moves from being a country that used to use thermal energy, and it will move and is already moving rapidly towards using renewable energy, with significant investment taking place in both wind and solar and battery storage. And that's on top of Ukraine's best performing international sector, which is IT.
I want to add one thing to that on IT. So I would broaden that to technology as a whole. Ukraine right now has the best technology innovation to battlefront pipeline in the world. It's remarkable. And it's not just drones. They're looking at EW, they're looking at, electronic warfare, they're looking at robotics. And so the trick for any clever investor is going to be, is there a way to duplicate kind of the US experience that we've done with DARPA and other defense tech, which is develop technology, which was originally aimed at defense, and then move that into the civilian sector. If we look at where the talent in IT is, we can look at Israel, Ukraine, Estonia, and one other country I forget, my apologies. But this is really an unparalleled opportunity for someone who can see that.
Thank you, Howard. Walter.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that question. That was a wonderful question that was asked by Mr. Donovan. But I was going to follow up with that to both of you in terms of an integrated plan, because that's the first question I was going to ask is, which industries do you think are going to be the first ones to sort of begin to recover? That's where you basically want to show, and you want to show the rest of the world that, you know, things are getting better. And you've named those. But the second question is, and the third is possibly related, is we also know we were at conferences. Jacques, you may have been there in 2009 in Calgary, and we saw 19 institutions of higher learning. Professor Taylor, you know the area, and it's all physics, cybernetics, mathematics, and so on and so forth. And so, and I remember one of the spokesmen from the Clinton administration on innovation, Einhorn, showed up and said, "Gang, I'm not going to be selling you NATO or EU. I'm going to be selling you cloud, and you joining cloud." And now the question is, have you, either one of you, sensed that there is a kind of larger program that's being involved, where it's not just about capital, material capital, but human capital, and the fact that they've got all these brainy folks running around Ukraine? Do you sense that either public sector or it's including something as large as as CM, are we beginning to see them seeing that you got to invest in that capital and sustain that capital? In other words, those big universities and so on. How's that happen? Is there anything happening there? That's the question. Okay. Sorry about the complicated question.
John, do you want to take a first cut?
Yeah, sure. And it's nice to have the question coming from Volodya, and good to see him there. Thank you for inviting me to speak, Volodya. I think the sector that's going to bounce back most quickly is agriculture, followed by IT, and thirdly, metals and mining. Regarding the educational base and Ukraine's ability to develop education in the STEM sector, and to have that added on in university, and the universities then to be developing the type of graduates that Ukraine needs to fuel its IT sector, I really think that's in safe hands. And that's because I'm also on the board of Mariupol University. I spent a lot of time there looking at what we can do for students. And you already see the information going into that sector, the students coming through, the types of facilities that are available being improved, the pathway for developing technology companies through incubators and through tech funds is already in place. And that's because Ukraine is already producing, even despite war, a fantastic stream of investable tech products and investable tech services. So I think that continued Ukrainian strength in STEM, relating that into engineering and technology, as Howard said, I think is safe. The challenge, it goes back to the human resource one, making sure that the country meets the aspirations of those fantastically talented people, giving them the opportunities and income and life and standard of living that they need, because their jobs are incredibly transportable.
Thank you, Jack. Howard.
I'll add that on the government end, I don't know if there's a consistent, coherent program, but I can tell you the Ministry of Digital Transformation certainly sees the possibilities and is working across the defense sector on the one hand and the civilian sector on the other. Everyone knows about the DIA app. There's the development of the Maria app for education. So, to the extent that that can get propagated throughout the government, that'll be necessary. But at least there is one very forward-looking pocket of the government that is focusing on this very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, gentlemen, I would like to thank you for everything you do for Ukraine and for your expertise.
Thank you. Remind me your name.
My name is Alexander Taran.
Alexander. All right.
I'm the president of Statehood, our organization. And as a Ukrainian, it's incredible to see how much effort is being put into ensuring Ukraine is a stable, guaranteed future and future economy as well. My question is, you have, as you have said, the biggest issue will be in a post-war Ukraine, the labor force, the lack of it. I think the primary idea is for us to try to return our refugees that have immigrated. But my question is, what if that does not happen at a sustainable level and we do not get as much refugees back to Ukraine? What are the other solutions that are present? And what could be the consequences if we do not receive enough labor force? Thank you.
Alexander, thank you. This is probably the last question. But Howard, would you like to start off? Yeah.
Thanks. That's a hard question. I will have to compliment the question because you always have to think of contingencies, and we try to avoid that. So there are different options. I don't think any of them are good. They're all second, third best. One option is increase the human capital of the resources you have. Okay, so you substitute skill for raw labor, and you try to bring in more investment, more capital. So you turn into a more capital-intensive economy. That's not easy. Nothing I'm saying is easier or first best. Second is immigration. Okay, so if you look at it, and the question there is, how easy is it to absorb immigrants and where are they going to come from? One of the reasons the United States has stayed very strong. This is not a comment on current immigration issues. I want to make that very clear. But when you look at demographics in the United States versus all of its peer economies, developed economies, the United States is the only one that is holding its own in population, and that's because of immigration. So the United States has managed to absorb immigrants very well, incorporate them into the economy and into society. That's a potential solution. The third option is the worst. It's a smaller economy, right? They're really, you either build skills and substitute people for skills, you bring in new people, or you just have a smaller economy. I'm very curious to know what the business community is thinking about this, because there must be contingency thinking.
So, Jack, you said you're looking for a lot of people. You've given that this question some thought.
Yeah, we have. And I was at lunch on Saturday with a big investor in the agricultural sector. And he was, we were sharing experiences. He was saying the same thing. The biggest challenge is labor. So the first challenge, and we're trying to deal with it at present, is structural. You have an element of structural incompatibility. The skills that there are people, but they don't have the skills you need. So training, and this is specifically vocational training to help people change from one career to another, is an area that we're working on. Let me give you an example. Because many folks mostly men who are working in our business DTech as electrical engineers, some of them were called up. That may now is a deficit. We need those folks to be able to replace and improve the lines which may be damaged or down. So we were able to hire some females and women who previously not thought of working in an industrial environment. And they came over and were retrained as electricians and are now working in DTech as electricians. So there's that structural change. The second aspect, of course, one of the reasons we have a shortage of employment, again, it's structural, is that about 10% of the labour force have been called up and are now in military or military-related roles. And that's going to change. It won't change completely, but it'll change significantly in a post-war environment. So one of the challenges is to ensure that you take veterans and you find them new roles. And veterans need a purpose in life. They've been doing the hardest job you could possibly imagine in tough conditions. And they need to be valued. And we need to show them that we value them. But we need to give them a future, a positive future. So taking veterans, providing them with training opportunities, reskilling them, and giving a new purpose back in the civilian economy is going to be another key element of providing employment. And then, I'll go back to Howard's point, which I fully agree with, is about how do you get people to return? Well, there's the pool of economy, which I was talking about, the need for that early recovery. But there's also, for example, getting the EU to say, well, look, why pay for Ukrainians to stay in your country? Why not persuade them that they will give them, that our European partners will give Ukrainians who want to come back to Ukraine, but are obviously concerned about the travel cost, availability of accommodation, the fact they might not have an income because they have to find a job. Why don't our European partners, rather than give them the money to stay in their country, help them with a relocation package to return back to Ukraine where we need their resource? And I think that will probably be part of any solution that we have in a post-war environment of encouraging people to return. I could go on, but maybe immigration, I will say, look, I think immigration will change in Ukraine. There will be more people coming in, and we need to look at those countries around Ukraine, possibly around Ukraine, that have similar cultural and linguistic and historical values, who could potentially come and work in the country.
Dr. Mendoza-Wilson and Dr. Howard Schatz, thank you very much for your insights on these questions. This has been, and Kurt Boger is here. Kurt wants a final comment.
I just had to comment after Jock here. Great to see you, Jock. Thank you. On a very big
Good to see you, Kurt.
Big screen here in this room. But just on the subject of retraining and education, I just wanted to put in a plug for the American University Kyiv. We do digital tech training, EPAM partner there, DTech Academy, one of our partners there. It is a great place for education of the future workforce of Ukraine. So just wanted to put in a plug for that for everybody. And our first honorary doctor of the American University of Kyiv is moderating this conversation, Ambassador Dr. Bill Taylor.
Excellent.
I am honored by the American University of Kyiv. And I'm very honored to be moderating this. Walter, thank you very much. And on behalf of my co-panelists here, it's back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Good back.
Nice job, Robert. That was great. Yeah.